Lesson 37. We have the last section of the philosophy of the Kleshas. It's the last section of chapter 2 of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, in which he explains the purpose of yoga being basically to avoid misery. So it's the science of misery and how to avoid it, most importantly. We have arrived at Sutra 20. The seer is pure consciousness, but though pure, appears to see through the mind. So here Patanjali touches upon the big issue that we are dealing with. Human beings, when in a contemplative mood, are very able to connect with the essence of whatever it is that you're dealing with. The problem is, your crown chakra doesn't possess the intellect to interpret what you are sensing in your contemplation. So, what Patanjali is describing here is the issue that we have with the translator, or the problem that we have with the translator. The translator of, or the interpreter of whatever it is that we sense on a higher level of consciousness is conditioned and limited because of that conditioning. The way that the mind or the intellect interprets what we sense is based on what we already know. Especially if we are not aware of that and try to avoid that. So we are always looking at situations in life through the lens of what we have already experienced. What Patanjali is working towards here is to give us the ability, the possibility to think outside of the box of our conditioning. And that requires silence, that requires deep silence in which we contemplate. So, for unconditioned people, they always see things through the lens of what they have experienced, incapable of seeing what is outside of the scope of their experiences. So they will always interpret everything based on what they know, and they're not open to anything that is outside of that experience. It is something that I've described maybe during the introduction workshop or in the beginning of the course, where I mentioned something about genius. So we live in a world now where many people are subjected to compulsory education for many, many years. And many people end up in higher education with a degree, and we think that makes people very smart. The fact that you have a degree or multiple degrees does not make you a genius. It gives you a very strong mental capacity, but all that it does is enable you to repeat what you have learned. Genius occurs when you combine that highly developed intellect with the power of contemplation in the crown chakra. When the two starts working together, you develop the ability to think outside of the box, and that is where you stop simply recreating or repeating what you have learned, you start to add to it. You start, because you develop the ability to deeply contemplate what you have learned, you start to develop new insights. That is where genius comes from. So that is the power of the yogi. That is the power of the person who can contemplate, or who reconditions themselves through a practice like yoga. Any kind of spiritual practice would lead to that development. That is where you stop being imprisoned in a box of the sum of your experiences. That is where you are able to throw off those lenses through which you see a very limited world and develop the ability to see new things, things that have never been part of your experience yet. So it's key in all this is simply the consciousness, and Patanjali describing this issue helps us to be aware of this. Simply to have the consciousness that this is how we function, and whenever it is that you are looking at situations that you find yourself in, or study materials for that matter, including yoga, you are aware of your limitations at first, and you try to not be hampered by that. You try to look beyond that, using your contemplative power. Sutra 21. The very being of the seen is for his sake, is for your sake, i.e. Prakriti exists only for your sake. Prakriti is the material world, the world of matter. Here Patanjali says something that is also described in the Bible, that says, and God created the world for man. The world is there for us, not to be abused and destroyed as we see is happening on a industrial scale in the past couple of centuries since the Industrial Revolution. The world is there to support us. The world is there to give us life, oxygen, food, nutrients, warmth. And if we use the world around us, the world of matter, in a constructive way, not in a destructive way, in a greedy way, it will in fact help us in a spiritual way, support us and promote spirituality. We will come back to that more. Last week we had a sutra also that alluded to that. But first, Sutra 22. Although it becomes non-existent for him whose purpose has been fulfilled, it continues to exist for others on account of being common to others. This is one of the diseases of the disciple, not in a negative way, although it can manifest in a negative way when you're not aware of it. If you have moved around in spiritual circles, you may have found that there's a lot of arrogance among spiritual people. Spirituality leads to increased consciousness, and it leads people to think that they are different, superior to people who are not on the spiritual path. What we forget is that we were like that before ourselves. Patanjali here is presenting us that issue by saying, although it becomes non-existent for him whose purpose has been fulfilled, spirituality, it continues to exist for others who are not on that path because of ignorance. Spiritual people have a tendency, because of mindfulness, you become a perfectionist. Because whatever it is that you do, you focus on it, and you do it into the smallest detail. That leads to intolerance of people who are not so meticulous, who are not so precise in the way that they do things. So we get angry or upset, and we scold those people for being stupid. And Patanjali says, don't make that mistake. You were once just as imperfect and stupid as they still are. You had the benefit of finding this new way of living, so be grateful instead of treating people in a negative way. Who treat them with compassion, understanding. It's like parents who forbid their children to dance in the rain, for example, because they forgot how it was to be a child themselves. As spiritual people, we develop sensitivity and a consciousness that change the way that we function, but it happens very gradually. It happens so gradually that we are almost not aware of the process. It's like when you have a child yourself, you don't see it growing, because every day a little bit of growth is added to the child. So 2 years later, 5 years later, you haven't really seen particular growth, although you remember that 5 years ago the child was a lot smaller. But as an uncle, meeting your nephew or niece once a year, you see great difference, big difference. You see growth taking place. So like the parent not being able to see their child growing, we are on a path of dynamic growth, but because it is very incremental, day by day, little pieces of growth, we don't really see it, leading to this situation where we find ourselves smarter, more mindful, almost eccentric in the ways that we do things with a certain perfection, that we can't tolerate other people not being like that. And it does lead to people acting in ugly ways, nasty ways, which then can be questioned is, what does this have to do with spirituality? But you find this in spiritual circles, out of ignorance. So replace that irritation with compassion. And instead of feeling bad about people's imperfection or even scolding them, try to help them instead, if they allow you to do so. Sutra 23 is more related to Sutra 21. The purpose of the coming together of the Purusha and Prakriti, Purusha is the spirit or the soul, Prakriti is the material world, is gaining by the Purusha of the awareness of their true nature and the unfoldment of powers inherent in them and Prakriti. I translate this sutra as the world is your playground. The world has been created, God has created the world for man. Patanjali has said something similar in a text that we read last week. When you start living more consciously, every experience becomes a learning experience. Because whatever it is that you do leads to certain outcomes that normal people either accept or don't accept, reject or accept, complain about or laud, for that matter. We're always inclined to judge, to put labels on things, good and bad. As a yogi, however, you stop making that division. Instead, you always have a tendency to draw a conclusion from whatever it is happening. You learn. Every experience becomes a learning experience, leading to incredible growth and development in the long term. Maturation. So, the world is your playground. Play, but start playing consciously. In this sense, we have explained Kriya as meaning to do, but not just doing, because that is what the whole world is doing. That is where all the misery and suffering comes from. Kriya means to do, but do in a very specific way. In the case of yoga, that means to follow a certain framework, systematically developed, that leads to consciousness and transformation. In that sense, we talked about the concept of bhoga, which is the yoga way of enjoying things. There are many people on the spiritual path who deny themselves every little bit of enjoyment because they think that is bad for their development. It will destroy their ability to meditate and it will destroy their pursuit of spirituality. That is far from the truth. Enjoyment is energy. It is a vital energy. The problem with enjoyment is if you overdo it, you destroy that energy. So if you are aware of that, you set certain boundaries. You can enjoy a glass of wine and allow it to elevate your spirit. In English, in the English language, spirits is not only about the soul. Spirits is also whiskey or cognac, and there is a reason why it's called spirits. So if you allow yourself a small amount of spirits, of alcohol, of wine or beer, it elevates your spirit, in fact. But you take too much of it, it will do the opposite. After the elevation, it will lead to a dark hole. Bhoga means not denying yourself the pleasures of life, but enjoying them consciously, so that it actually adds to your spiritual development. But it means control, and that for many people is very difficult. It means to install self-control in how you enjoy things in life. And that's all a game. That is what we have learned from Pratyahara, lesson 28-29. Instead of taking it very serious and become tensed about it, we start to play with our weaknesses and turning them into our strength. We start to play with our tendencies, and when we come to the conclusion that they become an obstacle to our development, we try to control them to the extent that it doesn't damage our development. So instead of being very serious about it, which in itself is a reason to block energy, a cause of energy being blocked, we approach it in a playful way. So, for Sutra 24, you see there's it starts with a question: how are the knower and the known unified? And I made a side note there. Why do we suffer? The reason why we suffer is because we don't realize suffering has a reason and a purpose. And Patanjali says, Sutra 24, its cause is the lack of awareness of his real nature. One of the things that I repeat again and again is the fact that people see suffering and misery as something that is negative. The reason why we see it as negative is because it hurts, one way or another. The view that is presented here is that misery is caused by ignorance, which means it just happens out of the blue. Before we know it, it has hit us, and we have to suffer the consequences. Patanjali is suggesting that there is a way to turn suffering and misery into a positive by first destroying the ignorance, of course, and learning valuable lessons from the misery and the suffering. It's something that I repeat many times because as human beings, we are only human, and we continue to fall back into our old patterns. And although we learn something very revealing, we find ourselves a moment later doing the same thing again. By repeating it again and again, it slowly but certainly starts to integrate into how we function. And the moment that we are in a situation where it applies, we first tend to react in our old way, but then we have this switch that says, wait a minute, there is something to learn here. There is something that I can pull out of this that turns the negative into a positive. And that, in that way, it becomes second nature to function in that way in everyday situations. Sutra 25 again starts with the question also, how can the knower and the known be separated? Sutra 25, the dissociation of Purusha and Prakriti brought about by the dispersion of avidya is the real remedy, and that is the liberation of the seer. It sounds very complicated because of the Sanskrit words that are being used here, but it is really all about consciousness. Avidya is ignorance, which is the first of the 5 Kleshas. That is the cause of the 4 Kleshas that come after it. Egoism, attachment, hatred, and fear. Fear of death. Which basically covers all suffering and misery that we experience in life. Patanjali has compacted all suffering and misery in life into 5 concepts. Starting with ignorance, and out of ignorance come egoism, attachment, hatred, and fear of death. How is that avoided? How can this be avoided? How can we separate learn to distinguish between the soul consciousness, Purusha, and the material world. That is by destroying avidya, by destroying our ignorance. And the question then is, of course, how do you do that? Sutra 26. How do you get rid of avidya? The uninterrupted practice of the awareness of the real is the means of dispersion. That sounds very complicated again also, but it means stay alert. Don't fall asleep anymore. Don't go through life with the eyes closed or with blinders on. Stay alert. Keep your eyes open. Pay attention. And Sutra 27 tells us how to do that, because there is a reason why human beings have blinders on and go through life with their eyes closed, because it is only human, out of ignorance. So the conclusion of chapter 2 of Patanjali is very simple. Sutra 27 says, in his case, the highest stage of enlightenment is reached by 7 stages. So how is all suffering and misery solved, and how do we get rid of ignorance? It is reached by 7 stages. Which 7 stages? The 7 limbs of yoga. Yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, and dhyana. Why does he not mention 8 stages? Because the 8th stage is the enlightenment that he mentions here, or the liberation that he liberation from the suffering and the misery that you try to achieve. That is the 8th limb, which is samadhi, which is contemplation. And Sutra 28, the last one. Viveka Khyati, it starts with a question again. How can we develop Viveka Khyati? Viveka Khyati is the ultimate alertness or super consciousness. How can we develop Viveka Khyati? From the practice of the component exercises of yoga on the destruction of impurity arises spiritual illumination, which develops into awareness of reality. So yoga, practice, 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 practice. That is the answer. On the destruction of impurity is your awareness of how you are conditioned, and that you learn to function out of the box. Learn to live out of the box. The limitations that are being put onto you by your experiences since you were born, which you see is limiting many people if you look around you. So on the destruction of impurity, impurity is that conditioning that limits us, arises spiritual illumination, which develops into awareness of reality. Awareness of reality is the opposite of avidya or ignorance. It allows you to see what other people can't see. So ignorance turns into insight and wisdom. And it was a long story, 28 sutras, 8 lessons we spent on studying this, and the conclusion is practice, practice, practice. Yoga is a science, it's a wonderful science, but it is a science based on practice. It has a practical component that without the practical component, it doesn't work. And we saw in chapter 1 of the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, where Svatmarama also said, just reading of the scriptures doesn't make you a yogi. It doesn't lead to transformation. It doesn't lead to consciousness. Practice does the work, and the reading of the scriptures will greatly aid in your development. But it is an empty vessel if it is not carried by a foundation of practice. And that is the 8 limbs of yoga, practice. If you understand yoga, the way that it is presented, especially the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, because the Hatha Yoga Pradipika is more practical than the sutras of Patanjali. Patanjali is more complicated, more philosophical. But if you understand it, if you have undergone the practice of yoga in the proper way, you realize the miraculous systematic approach that is in it. That most yoga practitioners around the world, they have no idea of this amazing systematic approach, step-by-step approach. Everything makes sense, everything fits together, if only you can see it. And the only way to see it is to experience it. And of course, it is very important that you learn it in the right way. And that is lacking in most yoga programs. Everything is compartmentalized. Here you have asana, here you have mudra, here you have pranayama, and nobody actually sees the connection between those. All right, we have Sambhavi Mudra today, which is an energy control exercise, more powerful than pranayama. And we also have a new pranayama exercise today. So we will discuss those two after the asana practice. Okay, let's have a short break.